I shall now proceed to the bank regulations. It is the government's policy to promote and maintain a stable and efficient banking system. And it is a government policy to promote and maintain a stable and efficient banking system that is competitive, dynamic, and responsive. That is competitive, dynamic, and responsive. So the government has set, the legislative branch has enacted the following statutes, and BSP and the relevant authorities have made the following regulations. The statutes in bank regulation include the following. We have the General Banking Law. The General Banking Law that governs the banking industry. General Banking Law. All banks are covered under the General Banking Law. I repeat, all banks are covered under the General Banking Law. Then we have the following special banking laws. They apply to specific types of banks. Thrift Bank Act. This law is applicable to savings banks. Savings banks. The Thrift Bank Act is applicable to savings banks. Rural Bank Act would be applicable to, of course, rural banks. The Philippine Cooperative Code to those banks organized as cooperatives. The Charter of Al-Amanah is the law that governs the Islamic banks. Is the law that governs the Islamic banks. So, what law applies to all banks? The General Banking Law. General Banking Law, this applies to all banks incorporated in the Philippines, the entire banking industry in the Philippines. Now, if the bank is a savings bank, the Thrift Bank Act would govern it together with the General Banking Law. Rural banks, we have the Rural Bank Act. If it is a bank organized as a cooperative, the Philippine Cooperative Code. And the Charter of Al-Amanah would be applicable to Islamic banks. On top of these statutes, these are statutes enacted by Congress. We also have the following. We have the MORB. We have the MORB, Manual of Regulation for Banks. So on top of this, we have the MORB, the Manual of Regulation for Banks. MORB. Now, BSP, via the Monetary Board, has an oversight and can examine the banks. BSP has the authority of oversight and examination over the banks. So, sino sa BSP? Through the Monetary Board. Now, the relevant agencies involved include the Philippine Deposit Insurance Corporation, PDIC. Philippine Deposit Insurance Corporation, PDIC, with a maximum coverage of 500,000 per deposit per bank. I believe deposit means person. No? Deposit means person here. PDIC, Philippine Deposit Insurance Corporation, now will ensure that depositors will take back their money at a maximum of 500,000 per deposit per bank. So any amounts exceeding 500,000, if it is deposited in a bank that goes bankrupt, it's no longer guaranteed. It's no longer covered by the PDIC insurance. Okay? I repeat, the BSP via the Monetary Board has oversight and examination over the banking industry. PDIC will cover, in the event of liquidation of a bank, a maximum coverage of 500,000 per deposit per bank. So if you're going to look at the regulations, they're intended to protect the depositors. Now, currently, the challenges by the way, the PDIC can examine every 12 months every 12 months. So the PDIC will have the authority to examine, no? Examine. Will have the authority to examine the bank every 12 months. Now, the challenges involving banks nowadays include the following: the regulation of the banks, the following challenges: KYC requirements, know your customer requirements. KYC requirements, that's the know your customer requirements. This is to prevent money laundering. Okay, to prevent money laundering. So there are those people who create dummy accounts in order to launder money. Dinadaan yung pera sa bangko, tapos dami yung account, hindi totoo yung tao, para maiwasan malaman kung may illegal na pera ang pumasok sa tao. Data Privacy Act is becoming increasingly important because the customers are required to submit certain requirements in order to open a bank account, in order to use the services of the bank. The banks should make sure the privacy of the customers are being protected. Data Privacy Act. What are the consumer protection standards? What are the consumer protection standards? Number one, disclosure and transparency. Importante to pagdating sa effective interest rate. When you borrow from a bank, the bank is obliged to tell you the true interest rate. Not only the nominal rate, sasabihin nila ay 5% lang yan. But when you do the most accurate calculation, you would find out that it has a higher interest rate. So disclosure and transparency is important. Okay? The effective interest rate of the loan should be disclosed. Just an example. Protection of client information, the privacy of the client, confidentiality, making sure that the client is protected from scammers, etc. Fair treatment, fair treatment, effective recourse. Pag may pagkukulang yung bank, dapat effectively binabalik ng bank yung kawalan ng customer. If it is due to the fact that the bank is on the erring side, no? The bank is the one who made the error. Financial education. Financial education. The consumer protection standards for banks include the following: disclosure and transparency, protection of client info, fair treatment, effective recourse, and financial education. Anticipated future changes in regulatory and legal policy. Anticipated future changes in regulatory and legal policy. Number one is the alignment with international standards. Kung napansin nyo, tinitingnan natin kung compliant ba yung mga banks natin sa mga gustong mangyari ng Basel Accords. Okay? We see to it that the Basel Accords, if not exceeded, at least are being complied by the banks. Alignment with international standards. Alignment with international standards. So the practice of banking here in the Philippines should be at par with those that are practicing in other countries. Strengthening of anti-money laundering capabilities and risk management systems. So the most recent example was that of RCBC. Okay, people from China, okay, they took advantage of our holidays in order to steal from the Bangladesh Central Bank, no? The Central Bank in Bangladesh. So pinasok nila yung pera galing sa Central Bank ng Bangladesh to different banks across the globe. Okay? So the money was being stolen from Bangladesh by jamming their printer. So ang ginawa, para hindi mapansin ng mga authority sa Bangladesh agad-agad, sinira nila yung printer. Nilagyan nila ng virus yung printer doon sa Central Bank ng Bangladesh. Afterwards, they put the money in different accounts across the globe. Most of the most of the most of the money attempted to be stolen, most of those amounts were intercepted, hindi na nakaw, except for one bank, sa RCBC. Okay? So, yung mga naglo-launder ng ninakaw na pera, nakuha nila yung pera nila through RCBC, tapos lumipad sila papuntang Macau. They went to Macau. And once you are in Macau, you can buy chips in the casino, and there you go. You are free to go. Instead of holding money, just hold casino chips. Okay? Lahat ng mga bangko nakaharang except yung RCBC, no? Those money going to different rich and poor countries, they were intercepted by the banks in those countries. In the US and even in the smaller countries, no? Even in the poorer countries. But in the Philippines, nadaya tayo, no? Via RCBC. Anyway, financial inclusion. Now, here in the Philippines, marami pa rin mga mahihirap, no? So, are they included the banking in the banking world, no? In the banking world. So, what do we what do we need to do in order to include the marginalized sectors of society in the banks? Okay? So, this is another changes to be made in the regulatory and legal policy. Okay? Yung maganda dito sa atin, yung mga ATM na payroll, walang minimum balance. No? Sa mga minimum wage earner, okay, yung maintaining balance, mabigat na yan sa kanila, no? Sa minimum wage earner. Fortunately, for payroll services, banks do not require a maintaining balance. And finally, addressing the risk and encouraging innovation in technology. Okay? Anong pinakapatok sa technology ngayon? Blockchain, cryptocurrency, no? So how are we going to transfer money? Is it through the traditional method? Why don't we do it through cryptocurrency? Because it's faster. Okay? And some of the banks in the world actually are considering creating their own crypto, no? Sariling Bitcoin nila. Okay? Punishment, no? By the way, the reserve requirement ratio. The reserve requirement ratio today is 12%. Sorry. The last time I checked was 2020 March. So the last change that I noted was March of 2020. The reserve requirement ratio was 12% then. Alam nyo na anong ibig sabihin nito, no? I already discussed. This has something to do with money creation. Enforcing banking laws and regulations. So these are the boring parts. So a fine of 50K to 100K. Imprisonment of 1 to 5 years. For those who refuse to file requirements to BSP and those who refuse examination. For banks who do not want to file requirements, for banks who do not want to be examined, the decision maker may be charged 50K to 100K. The bank may be charged 50K to 100K. And the board members may go to prison 1 to 5 years. A fine of 50K to 200K and an imprisonment of up to 5 years. For those who are willfully misleading, for those who made willful misleading misstatements. Willful misleading misstatements. So, dinadaya yung capital adequacy ratio, nananadya. Instead of presenting the true capital adequacy ratio, the true CAR, they presented a fake CAR just to comply with the Basel standards. Willful misleading misstatements, the fine is 50K to 200K, imprisonment of up to 5 years. Willful violation of banking laws. If there's a violation of the statute, 50K to 200K, the board may be imprisoned. Board or management, whoever is involved, may be imprisoned for 2 to 10 years. 2 to 10 years. Okay? Administrative sanctions. So itong mga penalty na to, judiciary to, no? Yung korte yung nagde-decide. The courts decide on this. We also have administrative sanctions and be enforced by the executive branch. Fine of a maximum of 30K per day for each violation. A fine can be given for a maximum of 30K per day for each violation. What the executive branch can do is to suspend the rediscounting and access to BSP credit. Hindi pwedeng mangutang yung bangko kung may violation. Pwedeng gawin ng BSP yan. So, suspension of rediscounting and access to the BSP credit. Also, we have the suspension of lending, forex operations, and authority to accept new deposits and make new investments. Also, another suspension, interbank clearing, yung pagpapadala ng cheque sa iba't ibang bangko. So, suspended kapag sinanction ng BSP. Okay? So, these are the administrative sanctions for those who violate the banking laws. And finally, last recourse, revocation of license. You can no longer operate the bank. Okay? You can no longer operate the bank. Those are the administrative sanctions. Okay. Common enforcement issues. Common enforcement issues. When it comes to enforcing laws and regulation to banks, the following are the concerns. Cybersecurity. Okay, cybersecurity. Are the information systems of the banks protected from hackers and scammers? And as I've said a while ago, another enforcement issue would be money laundering. Money laundering. So these are the issues in enforcement. Okay. Now, can the government take over the bank? Can the government take over the bank? The answer is yes, as a conservator. The government may require a takeover. The conservator is someone who takes charge of assets and liabilities of a bank, manage and reorganize, collect monies due, and restore viability if the bank is bankrupt. So when the bank is bankrupt, one of the things that can happen is you would try to make it live again. Okay? It is on life support. If the bank is still in life support, the government may assign a conservator. A conservator is usually another entity who would take charge of the assets and liabilities, manage and reorganize the bank, collect the monies due, especially the loans, restore viability. Okay? Restore viability. Kung kaya pang isalba yung bangko. Okay? So, sino yung mga sinalba ng government? Yung UCPB na yan, no? Yung United Coconut. Okay. United Coconut, UCPB, it's already in the brink of no, 50-50, no? Nagkaroon ng time na 50-50 yan. The government build it out. Okay? So the government may assign a conservator to take charge of the assets and liabilities, manage and reorganize, collect monies due, and restore viability. Now, receivership and liquidator. Kung wala ng pag-asa ha, you really have to liquidate the bank. You really have to kill the bank. It's already dead. Okay? Receivership and liquidator would be the PDIC. So si PDIC, bayaran niya muna yung mga depositor. Naka-insure yan, no? 500,000 per account. 500,000 per head. The PDIC will be the one to give the money to the depositors, a maximum of 500,000 covered. So receivership and liquidator will be the PDIC. If a conservator will no longer work or is not working, talagang namamatay na yung bank, we will proceed to liquidation. Who is the receiver? Who is the liquidator? It is PDIC. PDIC. Capital adequacy requirements. Universal banks with 100 branches, 20 billion pesos minimum. Okay? Ito yung mga minimum. Capital adequacy requirements. Universal bank of 100 branches, 20 billion pesos. Commercial bank of 100 branches, 15 billion. Universal bank of 100 branches, 20 billion. Commercial bank of 100 branches, the minimum is 15 billion. So, yung capital adequacy requirement naman, na-discuss na rin natin. Do you have any question? Do you have any question?
None po, sir.
Okay, so no more questions. So if there are no more questions, this is the assignment. Okay. This is what you are going to do. So I want you to calculate the four ratios. Ano yung apat? The four ratios. Wait lang. The lesson has ended, so I'm going to stop recording.